Hello to everyone online and to all of you in the room, and congratulations on embodying emotion in a talk about the embodiment of emotion. So the Friday evening discourse format which we are embodying this evening carries with it a bunch of routines which put a lot of stress on the lecturer, and you've beautifully expressed them. We're going to await the bell as we move towards questions, both from the live stream audience and from those of you in the theatre. Can I just say as well that I think rather effortlessly you've done the two things that discourses are supposed to do. So a lot of the work that you've presented, and we'll come back to this, is your own work, but also you've given us, I think, a sense of the progression from simplicity to complexity, and also some speculation about the future, which is very elegant. It's difficult to combine both your own work and a survey of the field. I think you've done the two very well. I'm going to ask you a quick question as a neuroscientist to start with, but those of you in the room who'd like to ask questions, please give a twitch and the microphones will come towards you. Look, there's one. As a neuroscientist, I couldn't help noticing that some of the architectures that you described for the models of thinking that your machines were doing were based a little bit on human architecture. And I just wonder the extent to which, if you're not a roboticist, as roboticists, should we be copying the way that humans do things, or should we be trying to do things better? In other words, is human the best we can do in terms of interacting with humans, or could there be quite another way of interacting, better than a human, which doesn't depend on a human architecture? Does the question make sense?
So, in fact, a lot of the roboticists, so I'm between, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a roboticist.
I wasn't accusing you of being a roboticist.
So I have started doing robotics in the last 9 years. But a lot of the time when we speak, when we start talking to various people who work with agents or robots, they would always cite that the interest initially came from trying to understand ourselves. So trying to build something from scratch and then try to provide or build some cognition into it, some sensing into it, and some learning into it really was to try to understand how we do this. How do humans actually, perceive things? So it was almost trying to replicate in a machine, but really the goal was initially to understand ourselves better and realizing how difficult it is to create such a machine to emulate human capabilities.
But I guess the question is whether building a good waiter helps you to understand human waiters better, or perhaps we should just forget about human waiters and make an amazing robot one, right?
That's right. So because we are able to access humans easily, so a lot of the things are human-inspired, in particular looking at interaction, so multimodal interaction, for instance, as another field. Because we can access how humans interact, it's actually mostly human-inspired, and some of the architectures I've shown as well. But it does not have to be that way. So what I was alluding to when I said emotional intelligence in artificial systems does not need to be like human emotional intelligence. This actually is applied to all of the different aspects that I have shown. So the sensing, the perception, the learning, and adaptation. It does not have to be that way. So we initially start by being, biological or human-inspired, but all of these, even the shape the robots could take, they might become really tiny and small. They don't have to look like human size exactly, big or exactly child size if it's interacting with the child. So all of these are definitely open for research and investigation.
I think we'll come back to Uncanny Valley. Now, there's research that shows when it comes to gender in audiences that if you ask a woman or somebody who identifies as female to ask the first question, the questions are generally of higher quality overall. So I'm going to bias towards anyone in that direction who would like to ask a question first. And I'm also going to go to the online world. We have a question here. Thanks, Rich.
Sort of following on from the question just asked.
There you go. That was the 1 hour bell. So you came close.
Which I couldn't.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes one just can't make it.
I was challenged, but yeah.
I was just wondering, as you were talking about the waiter example, whether people end up, expecting or responding differently to robots compared to humans. So whether robot behavior that's seen as intelligent or emotionally intelligent can actually look very different from human behavior, partly because we've got different expectations based on whether it's a robot or a human.
Right, so the feedback that we give to robots that we interact with is different than the feedback we give to humans that we interact with. And it's a bigger picture, right? So we all speak differently, don't we, when we're talking to the artificial dictation machines? We interact differently with non-human agents. What?
Yes. So one of the things we say is that because robots are not yet in society, like everywhere, we don't see robots everywhere. We see mobile phones everywhere, right? And we're almost used to actually people typing and walking with their phone and almost also watching out for not bumping into them and so on, because they have become part of our lives. They've really become part of the fabric of our lives. But robots are not yet. So we use them for experimental projects, mostly in the lab, but even when they're taken to, let's say, a bank or a cafe, it's still quite limited as well, because there are lots of limitations. But what this makes is then it mystifies them, meaning they're sort of a bit, unknown, and therefore people are not yet used to interacting with them. And therefore, if we start demystifying them by really making them, more available and starting to use them, then the behaviors that they show in studies like the one I presented will change as well. It will also evolve, and that's what I meant with coevolution.
So, because what I was wondering about whether partly the response to having the robot in front rather than behind was because it's a robot as opposed to a person. And so what you're saying is if robots became more normal, perhaps we'd then respond to them, we'd be more happy with them coming from behind.
So it will definitely change. It won't be the way it is when they are not yet out there and people only see them in very restricted settings. I cannot guarantee exactly how it will change, because obviously it will depend on how many mistakes they make and whether they bump into the person trying to approach from the back. So there will be all of these different aspects, just like when we interact with computers, when it crashes and we start saying, oh, my laptop is not very reliable in Zoom meetings or whatever. So it will definitely evolve. It's just that we do not know yet exactly whether it will be positive, like you say, and similar to how human waiters are perceived.
But you're kind of saying that we should reduce the threshold which a machine has to pass in order to be allowed into the wild so that they can get better. You wouldn't apply the same principle to self-driving cars, I guess.
Exactly. So
hot soup waiters, yeah.
Depends how safety critical it is. And it very much depends on the application and the target user groups. So sensitive groups like children and elderly. I mean, at the moment we have a project with children ongoing in terms of mental well-being assessment. And, the amount of ethics that we have to go through, the considerations we need to make sure everything is, so stringent and important. If you use it for entertainment, like I have shown, a robot dancing next to another dancer, if it falls because it's entertainment, people might laugh and, oh, okay, that's how a robot dances, right? But there's no safety critical aspects there, so that's, yeah.
Okay, I like stringent and important, so you're hedging as to whether you think the thresholds should be lower. We'll take a question there and then we'll come to the online world.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk. On your last slide, you sort of emphasized the point that humans influence machines by the sort of data we generate. Now, unfortunately, in sort of modern machine learning systems, we see a lot of bias. We see it in vision systems, in speech systems, in language systems. Given that those biases exist, I wonder what you think that means for sort of emotionally aware, intelligent technology. Could it be that perhaps, given those biases exist, a sort of technology that is being sold as emotionally intelligent could actually sort of amplify the harm that those biases could have on a user, perhaps?
So you're talking about the biases that are in people already and whether they're going to infect or pollute?
Yes, of course, biases are in people, but I think what we're seeing nowadays in sort of modern vision systems, for instance, that they're significantly better at recognizing a certain demographic, that language models are sort of, they sort of associate certain professions, for instance, predominantly with men rather than women and so on.
Yes, so in fact, I didn't present, but we have an ongoing stream of research on fairness and bias in facial expression recognition. Definitely for affective systems, investigating these came a bit later as compared to, for instance, face recognition, which relates to identity, not really expressivity aspects. And but we started working on this, and we already have some work and published papers regarding that. First of all, to investigate whether there is bias in terms of facial expression recognition, looking at various data sets, and then how we can mitigate this at the pre-processing level, in-processing level, and post-processing level. So we have quite a few papers, but what I can summarize is that as a field, and that's what I meant with responsibility, we are becoming more and more aware as we start seeing in various other fields how this is becoming amplified, or in a way, I wouldn't say we are behind, but we are catching up perhaps compared to these more like face recognition related aspects, because face recognition is currently being used already for like passport checks, and therefore, in a way, it was at the forefront for criticizing it in terms of bias and understanding. And we are doing, as a field, effective computing is actually really looking into the ethical aspects much more. So last year's conference really dedicated for ethical effective computing and proposing even theoretical architectures, how to make things more ethical. So there's a lot happening there, but you're right. I think in almost every field that relies on data, bias creeps into the data. That's what we also realized when we started investigating whether there is bias.
But there's a super interesting phenomenon happening, it feels to me, and I wonder what your sense is of this. So there's a move in AI, if we can say machine learning, that notices, oh my goodness, there are all these biases in the machines, they must have come from people. One response is to try and change the machines to overcome the bias in some form or another, and we can perhaps dig into that a little bit more. But it seems to bounce back into human behavior, where people are acknowledging, in other words, machines are throwing up a mirror to the human and making us realize how biased our behaviors are. So that, for example, blind recruiting, where you recruit people without knowing their names, certainly without having their photos, is becoming increasingly prevalent in HR policy. I wonder whether you think that this progress in AI is actually improving human behavior outside the domain of interaction with machines and robots. Does that question make sense?
I think definitely there is actually a correlation. So the more we become as societies and policies and governments, the more we become aware of certain aspects, obviously. I think I wouldn't say one is preceding the other. It's almost like hand in hand, we are learning from one another. So learning that the technology has certain biases makes us question ourselves as well. How actually, for instance, engineers and even PhD students at different levels, it becomes really a prominent topic. How much we actually encode in our code without realizing such biases. But at the same time, as we speak about this, obviously we reflect how we do this as humans as well.
So there's an improving effect of your research on humans, even if machines are not directly involved.
Well, I would really say that as a field, for instance, effective computing is an interesting one. By looking at data, we are in a way helping other domains like, theories in other fields. Because we are able to analyze, much more quickly. Certain things in psychology field without automating would take much longer. But, with machine learning and processing in terms of signals and computer vision and so on. So it really does fit one another. That's what I would say, yeah.
I love the idea of the machine-based conference on human learning, and they're going, these guys are getting much better at overcoming their biases. Now, talking of mediated interaction, Hassan, who's our talks manager here, has been carefully monitoring the online world. Hassan, what are they worried about in that space?
Well, we've got, as ever, the online world comes internationally, and we've got Tony from Athens, who's asking the following question. He says, Pixar's WALL-E was a fantastic example of communicating emotion using non-verbal cues. Given how well WALL-E did, I ask if there's any real benefit of only creating a human-looking machine. Does it mean that if we create EQ more easily and accurately if it's non-human looking?
So WALL-E, for those that don't know, would you like to give a quick verbal description of WALL-E? It's like a box, it kind of jumps up and down, but he doesn't have features, maybe he's got eyes and things. Yeah, so does a really non-human robot offer more potential than a really humanoid one?
So a robot does not have to look like a human. So that definitely is the first thing I want to say. It really depends on what we are trying to do. So I don't know if you have heard about robots playing soccer, for instance. Initially, it started as dog robots or dog-looking robots playing soccer, having a ball on sort of four arms, like four legs, and even the goalkeeper was actually a dog-looking sort of. So for this purpose, it did not really matter. And now they started investigating, of course, how human-looking robots would play soccer, and they even aim by certain 2050 or whatever, they're going to beat the human world champions in soccer and so on. So this really just is about like what the goal is. So for instance, when it came to working with autistic kids, what they found is that very sort of realistic looking, human looking robot was not really useful because people in the autism spectrum disorder already have difficulties interpreting various movements on the face of humans, right? So if you simplify this and make it more mechanical or robot looking, it simplifies some of these movements and makes things easier to interpret in terms of expressivity. So this is one example. So it really depends on what the goal is.
You spoke about international. I know there was a questioner from Silicon Valley. Did they have I'm inviting a question which I think is going in a certain direction that follows from this, Hassan.
Not so much from Silicon Valley as yet. Lots of comments. We've got one from Adrian from Birmingham, if that's it. Not as good, but it's a very good question. It says, could the original Turing test, where there is no organic feedback, be the ultimate test for personality of a robot despite an appropriate physical response?
So there have been not in the formal way of Turing test, but there have been evaluations in terms of various ways of whether how human or robot looking or behaving things are and how the perception is. But I'm not sure if I would say a certain test being the ultimate test for any capability or feature. As I said, this probably moves towards more generic artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of discussion ongoing about this, and I really don't want to go into that direction.
I sense your reluctance.
Yeah.
So with the Silicon Valley, there's a question in the white shirt there just coming up, Hang, thank you. The uncanny valley is something that's discussed a lot, and we're very short on time, but I just wonder what your sense is of this kind of the weirdness that comes when robots get too human-like. Is that a real thing in your data, in the studies that you do?
So we didn't really, as you saw, we didn't really work with like very human-looking robots. So you might have seen some scientists, creating even like the skin. Sophia probably is the one you might have seen in mainstream media as sort of advertised as a robot, but in fact it's more like a chatbot with very sort of human-looking appearance.
Chatbot with great skin.
Great skin. So obviously, what happens is the mismatch between the behavior and appearance. When this starts becoming very obvious, this is when we start feeling there's something really weird going on in here, and that's the uncanny valley. But yeah.
So you've deliberately avoided that territory?
Yes, we have not. At the moment, we are in fact looking in terms of coaching, a different embodiment and how that impacts. And indeed, it might go back to some of the questions, and your question as well. Does it have to be that human-looking? So that's what we're interested as well.
And it's super interesting. Nowadays, it's much quicker to get online therapy than it is to get face-to-face therapy. And so we're kind of biasing the human experience of these kinds of therapeutic interactions a lot.
Hi, I was wondering, given the rise in voice-activated technology, how much you look, if at all, at kind of verbal cues to emotion and take inputs from things like tone of voice or vocabulary and things like that.
So as a group, my group doesn't focus too much on the verbal aspect, but the non-verbal aspects of speech, which relates to also, for us, more towards the emotions, like silences, changes in intonation, pitch, and all this. So we actually do look at those aspects, but verbal aspects go more towards NLP, natural language processing field, and that's yet another of the maybe people would not consider it as a subfield of AI, but it's another field on its own, and there's a lot of research going on in there. But definitely it would be more beneficial if we interact as fields much more, the non-verbal aspects with verbal aspects. But we focus, as a group, we focus more on the non-verbal aspects.
So, discourses have been going since 1825, but they're not the only things we do here. San, we have some other talks coming up, which is worth plugging both for the online audience and in person.
Absolutely. So on next Tuesday, we have Searching for New Physics with Low Energy Techniques coming from Danielle Speller from the States. In this lecture theatre on the Wednesday, we have another AI event, a panel event in which we'll be looking at the future of human love in the age of AI. And then Ed Young, award-winning science journalist, returns to the theatre on Thursday to talk about an immense world and exploring animal consciousness. And on Tuesday, the 5th of July, we have Emeritus Professor from Australia Institute of Physics, David Jemison, coming in to talk about Einstein's revolution, quantum technology for a 21st century quantum computer.
Very good. And the discourses will resume in September. Please keep your eyes open. If you're a member or a patron, you get a particularly exciting experience of the discourses. So I'd encourage those of you here and online who'd like to become patrons or members to do that. Now, if you're on the online world, I mean, you're invited, but you're almost certainly not going to make it in time for drinks outside. So please feel free to have a drink on us, as it were, on you. There will be drinks in the anteroom for those of you that are here, and I encourage you to continue the discussion. Online or in person, please do submit some online feedback to tell us how we can do better. And if you're in the building, you can tell people with blue badges how we can continue Faraday's tradition in the best possible way. But before we go for drinks, please join me in thanking our speaker in person and online for her extraordinary discourse this evening. Thank you very much, Hatice.